How's everybody doing? And welcome back. It's Mr. Arvites. This is another coronavirus history lesson. We're in U.S. history, and we're looking at the end game. That's right, the fall of Japan in 1945. Now, when we last left off, we were looking at the Pacific Theater throughout January to around April, June of 1945. And what we had seen were the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and how these battles had become increasingly more and more violent. And that is ultimately the thought process that the U.S. military, the U.S. political leadership is going to have to take into consideration. How violent will the fall of Japan be for the United States? And then, do the American people have the stomach to push forward with it? Because by the summer of 1945, there's increasing sentiment to end the war. Americans are tired of the 4 years of fighting. They want it to end. They do also want the absolute surrender. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, remember, that was one of the things they said. This is going to be an absolute surrender. At Potsdam in Germany, right after the fall of Germany, they said it will be an absolute surrender. We will not accept any terms from Japan. So what are the Allies greeted with from the Japanese? They're greeted with, two of the most violent battles of the entire war, and that's, of course, Okinawa and Iwo Jima. The United States is, though, going to be planning for a landed invasion of Japan. The hope is that the strategic bombing will work. And as we remember, they're constantly bombing cities. They're going to bomb every major industrial center in Japan, destroy their ability to produce almost completely, though the Japanese still manage to keep producing things very slowly but surely. But we're going to constantly bomb. Civilians are going to pay a heavy toll in Japan. Over 600,000 people will die in fire bombings. We have over 1 million die in just strategic bombings alone. And so Japan is suffering mightily. You factor in other things that are going on at the same time. In China, they're beginning to lose ground. U.S. bases and then eventually a Soviet buildup on the Mongolian border are posing severe threats to the Japanese. The United States now controls Okinawa. That's within bombing range of the Japanese southern industrial centers. And we're going to be doing that every day. And I think it's important to understand that the United States did have the ability to do this. Remember, now that the Atlantic theater is over, we're starting to reposition bombers, move soldiers, and we're going to poise to build up, build up, build up. So what was that invasion of Japan, or at least a proposed invasion of Japan? Because I'm assuming all of you know that never happened. It was called Operation Downfall. And Operation Downfall is a multi-pronged invasion. The United States and Great Britain will invade with roughly 1.3 million soldiers in the first amphibious invasion, followed up by another million or so soldiers a week later. And then we have the Russians, who are supposed to commit at least 1.5 million soldiers to invading northern Japan. All of these things are supposed to happen. Now, to get that to go on, you would have to reallocate soldiers, obviously, put in more naval presence, and you'd have to destroy the Japanese ability to use any air power whatsoever. And that is being done. However, it is with a lot of risks. As we are making these plans and finalizing them, the Japanese are also training civilians, training more and more soldiers. They're training more and more kamikaze pilots. They've developed different techniques where they have planes that are specifically designed to be kamikaze planes. They have literally the flying warheads, right, where Japanese pilots would get in them, drop it from a bomber, and they'll fly that warhead straight into an American ship. These are things that scare the Americans in terms of the leadership of invading Japan. To put in perspective, American leadership estimated, and they ordered right around 400,000 body bags for the invasion of Japan. That is insane, right? That would almost double the U.S. deaths of the entire war. And they said that was even could have been on a low estimate. This could have been really, really violent if the Japanese decided to go fight to the last man. Luckily, though, there's going to be other options available. And the first option is strategic bombing. And that's going to be what the Allies try and do. But then Harry S. Truman, U.S. president, remember, he hasn't been president that long, taking over for FDR in April. Truman finds out about the Manhattan Project. Ironically, this is not something he knew about. And in fact, Joseph Stalin knew more about it than he did at first. And so Truman is going to find out about the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project is going to be immensely important going forward. The Manhattan Project started really with kind of Einstein is going to mail FDR a letter saying, look, the Germans were trying to build an atomic bomb. We need to get on top of this. And they're going to get a whole bunch of scientists, a lot of which are ex-German, and of course, Robert Oppenheimer being the most famous. And they're going to put tons and tons of money to this, right? There's numerous research sites all developing the same thing, all developing pieces to this puzzle. And the Manhattan Project is one of the largest R&D projects in the history of the U.S. military. At that time, it is the largest. And so they're going to develop the atomic bombs. Now, when Truman finds out about these, he then has to weigh a very substantial decision. And that decision is, will the United States use one of these weapons? And basically, he doesn't quite know the full extent of how much it'll destroy. No one really does. They have tested them in the desert, but they do know. I mean, you drop this on a city, everything within a couple of miles is going to be dead. It's going to just vaporize people who are right in the blast radius. And so he does know these things, and he knows that he's going to have to decide if they're going to drop him on a city or not. And that is going to be the moral question of the day is this the correct thing to do? But some people would argue in war, there are no morals, because obviously we've been firebombing cities. What's the difference between that and dropping a nuclear bomb? And so those are some of the questions that we pose. And if you're in my class, that is ultimately the big question you will write about is, the use of the atomic bomb. So as the atomic bombs are being developed, there are more things taking place, though. Okay, the Russians have begun invasions in Mongolia. And for the Japanese, they're seeing kind of defeats on all fronts now. They're being pushed out of their various colonial holdings. The Chinese have really started to push them across China, and the U.S. is bombing constantly day and night. And it's going to be in August, on August 6th, right? When and actually, the president, Harry Truman, made that decision a little bit before August 6th, obviously. But on August 6th, the Enola Gay is going to take off, and it's going to drop Little Boy, a uranium atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It explodes roughly about 95 feet above the surface. It has a 5-mile destruction radius where buildings are essentially going to be shattered for about 5 miles across. We're talking anywhere between 50 and 100,000 people dead in the initial blast. Now, when you look at casualties from the atomic bomb, I want to warn you, because you can go online and you can find a number of different casualty numbers. Those numbers range because we don't quite know exactly how many people are killed right away comparatively to the fallout effect, right? The radiation effect that takes place afterwards. Now, Truman announces that we have used this weapon, and a lot of people are shocked by this. The idea that you could drop one weapon and it would destroy an entire city was absolutely unbelievable. Americans kind of were like, wow, I didn't think that could actually take place. People were horrified by it. Joseph Stalin even has to take a little bit of a step back, like, okay, the Americans have a weapon that we really can't counter at this point as well, which is when he, of course, is going to really start to get on his people. Hey, we need to have one too. So the dropping of the first atomic bomb is very significant. We send Japan on August 7th an ultimatum, essentially, surrender or else. Now, for Japan, they don't give really a response because they're kind of surprised as well. And inside the Japanese High Council with Emperor Hirohito, he's kind of doesn't quite know what's going on, doesn't quite have a feel on it. The generals are like, there's no way they could have another one of these. There's no way they could have more. And after a day of waiting, we're going to say, okay, on August 9th, we're going to drop a second one. And we're going to drop this one on Nagasaki. This one, which Fat Man, right, is going to be dropped on Nagasaki. This is a plutonium-based bomb, and it is actually more explosive. It actually misses the drop spot, but still gets it anyway. We're talking 35 to 50,000 people killed in the initial blast, but much, much more later on. Remember, this is going to be cancer central. This is going to be burns, everything, just massive radiation poisoning. So we're talking well over 100,000 people in each of these areas dying in the aftermath of these things. And at that point, you would think Japan would surrender. But still, there was a little bit of like, do we surrender after August 9th? And Hirohito is horrified by this. It also comes on the heels of the news that the Russians have fully invaded Mongolia and are pouring into Manchuria. And they have a whole bunch of Japanese soldiers on the run. Remember, the Russian army is one of the best armies in the world now. They defeated the Nazis and they turned them around and they suck them on the Japanese, combined with the Chinese counter-assault and American bombings in the area. And so as the Japanese are thinking about this, we still bomb cities for the next couple of days. And it is ultimately going to be up to the emperor. And the emperor is going to send a message back to the United States, basically saying, look, if I can stay in charge, we surrender. Well, the U.S. is going to say, no, we're not having any ultimatums, nothing like that. It's total surrender. And that goes back and we bomb them for a couple more days. And finally, the U.S. is going to send a message to the emperor and basically say, look, you'll get to stay in power so long as you do everything we tell you. And Hirohito at that point is going to tell his general council that we will surrender. And he will give radio addresses and they will do their best to pacify the civilians, because this is an unthinkable thing culturally to surrender on a massive scale to everyone. And on August 14th, Japan will unconditionally surrender. When Truman gives the address saying this, there are people yelling in the streets. People run out into the streets. They're shooting fireworks off and they're just celebrating like nothing else. obviously not practicing social distancing at that point. And so the celebration is in total. Now, there is some fighting that still goes on. There's stories of some Japanese soldiers who maintained defensive islands until they were relieved of commanders. There's one in the mid-50s like that. It goes even further. So the Japanese are going to be pacified eventually, and all fighting does cease. In the military, there's a great story about a possible military coup that takes place, but ultimately it doesn't happen, and Japan is essentially going to surrender at that point. Now, the United States, keep in mind, had told Japan that we were going to drop more of these bombs, and we were. As they were being developed, we were just going to keep dropping them until they surrendered. So that is the ultimate way the war ends. And if you really think about World War II, how fitting a way for it to end like that. This is the most violent civilian war in all of human history. 65 million people died in World War II. Most of them are civilians. And the fact that it ends with the most horrible weapon developed by mankind being dropped on a city of civilians is pretty much indicative of the entire war. Because when we look at the horrors that took place with the Nazis killing Jews, killing Poles, killing gypsies, right? Killing handicapped homosexuals, right? All these different things. And then we look at what the Japanese did, where they killed Chinese civilians, did medical testing on them, killed POWs, bombed that. We look at the British firebombing Dresden. We look at the Russians going back and doing their thing in Poland, and of course the mass rapes that took place in Eastern Germany, and of course the United States firebombing cities. This is ultimately what this war was. It was a war on civilians. It was total war in the truest sense, and for that reason, Japan did surrender officially, right, in September. On September 1st is when they actually signed the peace treaty. And I always like to kind of show a picture at the end of this when they are surrendering, aboard the U.S. ships, and they have a giant flyover of all the U.S. planes that are in the area. And it is amazing for the Japanese to see this. Now, keep in mind, the U.S. fleet was massively larger than anything Japan had at this point in time, and so it became painfully obvious that they would surrender. When we look at the final death tolls of these various places, the USSR loses the most, obviously, with over 20 million people. China has the most interesting story of World War II that most people don't know, largely because China descended into communism and had a lot of restricted records. We don't quite know how many people were killed in the Civil War versus how many people were killed by the Japanese, but those estimates go from about 15 to around 22 million people in China. Poland, of course, loses a lot of people, over 5 million. Yugoslavia, 1.7. France, over 600,000. The United States, 418,000 soldiers dead in World War II. And Japan loses right around 2.8 to 3 million. Germany losing over 6.2 to 6.5 million, though Germany's numbers are a little skewed due to a lot of POW rates with the Russians. World War II is a lot of different things. And guys, as you go about ending this section, I want you to think about some of the aspects that really make World War II what it is. For the United States, it's our kind of show out party. It's when the United States becomes the world's superpower, quite frankly, because all the other superpowers are destroyed. And so it's us and Russia, the USSR, and we are the two lone superpowers left after World War II. There's other aspects of it as well. When you look at the Nazis, Germany, the totality, the evil of the Holocaust, over 6 million Jews killed, over 10 million people overall, it makes it a very justifiable war in a lot of people's minds. And so it looks like we're on the moral high end of the war. When you look at the Holocaust and the racial ideologies that went into the theories behind Nazi Germany, behind the Japanese, and behind the Italians, it makes this war about something far deeper than just territorial gains like in World War I. And so World War II has this kind of big feel to it. And in our history, it has been overly romanticized and, generally speaking, not often talked about as the tragedy that it is. And for all the heroes that we get of World War II, and I always say my grandfather was always my greatest hero for serving, there is an immense amount of tragedy that takes place in this war, and it's all about civilian deaths and civilian casualties.